Welcome to Crisis in Perception, where we examine the systems shaping our world, one book at a time.
Today we are opening the hood on the American machine. We are analyzing Deterring Democracy by Noam Chomsky.
And I have to admit, this one threw me for a loop. Usually when we cover history or foreign policy, there's a familiar rhythm to it. You
Sure.
have the good guys, the bad guys, the big conflict, and then some kind of resolution. It's a narrative. But reading this book, it didn't feel like a history book at all.
What did it feel like?
It felt like I was reading a blueprint, like an engineering diagram for a factory designed to produce these very specific outcomes that, frankly, have almost nothing to do with what we're told on the news.
That feeling you have, that sense of disorientation, is the crisis in perception that Chomsky is talking about. It's the core of the whole analysis.
In what sense?
Well, we're all trained, from childhood to view foreign policy as a series of reactions. The Soviets do something, so we react. Terrorists attack, so we react. We see the world as chaotic and our role in it as fundamentally defensive.
Right. We're just responding to threats as they pop up.
Exactly. And Chomsky's argument is that if you stop listening to what the leaders say,
Yeah.
and you just start measuring what they consistently do over decades,
Yeah.
you see something else entirely.
Which is?
A highly rational, remarkably consistent, and very successful system.
Okay, but that's a hard pill to swallow. I mean, we grew up with the Cold War. I remember the drills. We all know the story. It was this epic, titanic struggle for survival. Democracy versus totalitarianism. Freedom versus the gulag.
Of course.
Are we saying that was all fake? Because the threat of nuclear annihilation felt pretty real.
Oh, the weapons were absolutely real. The danger was real. But the story, the ideological framework of good versus evil, that, according to this analysis, was largely a construct, a tool.
A tool for what?
To understand this book, we have to perform a really difficult mental exercise. We have to separate the Cold War as a rhetorical device, as a story we tell ourselves, from the Cold War as a system of management.
A system of management. That sounds incredibly clinical for a conflict that almost blew up the world multiple times.
It is clinical. And that's why, for this deep dive, we have to approach it that way. We're using what the book presents as a diagnostic model.
Okay, what does that mean, a diagnostic model?
It means we're not here to pass moral judgment. We're not saying this is good or this is evil. We're just looking at the system as described in the book. The United States isn't stumbling through history. It is, according to Chomsky, executing a plan. And the goal of that plan isn't spreading democracy.
It's managing populations and protecting elite economic interests.
Precisely. That's the core thesis.
Okay, that is a huge claim, an extraordinary claim. And extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. So let's break this down.
Let's do it.
We've set up 4 main guideposts today to walk through this model. First, we're going to look at what the book calls the real motives of Cold War policy. Then we need to understand what the threat actually is. And spoiler alert, it's not what you think it is. Then, maybe the most important part, we have to figure out how the public is kept on board with all this. That's the manufacturing consent piece. And finally, we'll step back and map the whole system out.
Sounds good. Let's start with the motives. And to do that, we have to go back to the very beginning, to 1950, and to the blueprint document.
National Security Council Memorandum 68, NSC 68.
The foundational text of the Cold War.
I spent a lot of my weekend reading this document. It is wild. I was expecting dry, bureaucratic language. We recommend a 10% increase in naval appropriations due to Soviet posturing in the Baltic, that kind of thing.
And what did you find instead?
It reads like a sermon. Or a fantasy novel. I actually want to read a specific passage because it just jumps off the page. The document defines the entire global conflict as a battle between absolute evil and absolute good.
No gray area.
None. It calls the Soviet Union the slave state and says it's animated by a new fanatic faith antithetical to our own. And it gets better. It says the slave state has an implacable purpose to eliminate freedom everywhere on Earth.
It creates this completely binary universe.
Yeah.
There is no nuance. There are no competing geopolitical interests. There's just the forces of light against the forces of darkness. It's almost theological.
Exactly. And look, I get that it was 1950, tensions were high, the world was a scary place. But Chomsky points out something that just stopped me in my tracks.
What's that?
He notes that the authors of this document, men like Paul Nitze, Dean Acheson, they were not fanatics. They were sophisticated, Ivy League-educated corporate lawyers and investment bankers. They were the rational planners.
The so-called wise men.
Right. So why are they writing like fire and brimstone preachers? It doesn't compute.
That is the multi-billion-dollar question. And the book argues that the answer is in the data that they buried in the very same document.
The appendices.
Yes. If you dig into the appendices of NSC 68, the parts the public was never meant to read, the tone changes completely. It stops being a sermon and it becomes a spreadsheet.
And on that spreadsheet, they start comparing the actual economies, the real power dynamics.
And what do they admit in their own private analysis?
They admit the Soviet Union is economically backward, a mess. They admit its economy is just a fraction of the U.S. economy. They admit the U.S. military budget is already double that of the USSR. And, this is the kicker, they admit that the Soviet Union has essentially zero capability to attack North America.
So in the spreadsheet, they admit they are safe. But in the public-facing text, they claim the sky is falling. Why the disconnect?
Well, if you're safe, you don't really need to quadruple your military budget.
And that's exactly what NSC 68 called for. A massive, unprecedented explosion in defense spending in peacetime.
Right. So the scary language was a sales pitch.
It was a sales pitch. Paul Nitze, the main author, later admitted in an interview that the goal of that flowery, terrifying language was, in his words, to bludgeon the mass mind of top government.
Not just the public, but to scare the rest of the government.
To scare the bureaucracy, and by extension the public, into approving a massive tax hike for a permanent war economy. You don't get people to pay 90% marginal tax rates by saying, we need to subsidize the emerging tech sector.
No, you get it by saying, the slave state is coming for your children.
Precisely.
Okay, let's pause there because you just mentioned subsidizing the tech sector. This brings us to the concept of military Keynesianism. I've heard the term, but let's drill down on what it actually means in this model.
Okay.
The conventional story is that we built all those weapons to stay safe from the Russians. But Chomsky is arguing that we built the weapons to save the economy from itself.
Essentially, yes. We have to look at the context. This is 1950. What is the single biggest trauma in the living memory of these planners?
The Great Depression.
The Great Depression. The 1930s taught them a terrifying lesson. Capitalism, left to its own devices, is fundamentally unstable. It can and will collapse. The New Deal helped a bit, but it didn't fix the Depression. What fixed it?
World War II.
The war, a massive state-coordinated stimulus program. The government effectively took over the economy, poured unimaginable sums of money into production, and put everyone to work.
So as the war was ending, there was a genuine panic among the business elite.
A huge panic. Business Week was running articles saying, what happens when the war orders stop? They were terrified that if the government stopped spending, we go right back to the Depression of the 1930s.
So they needed a way to keep the government spending huge amounts of money on industry, but without competing with private businesses. You can't have the government building cars or houses because that hurts Ford and the construction lobby. That's socialism.
Precisely. If the government builds hospitals or schools or high-speed rail, that interferes with the private market. But if the government builds high-tech jets and missiles and radar systems and eventually computers,
nobody complains. It's for national security.
Exactly. The public pays for it through taxes, and the profits go to private corporations in the aerospace, electronics, and later the computer industries.
It's the perfect system. A public subsidy for private profit laundered through the Pentagon.
Think of the Pentagon not just as a military headquarters, but as a bank. Or maybe a state planning agency for the advanced sectors of the economy. It is a mechanism to transfer public wealth into high-tech industry.
And when you look at it that way, so much of the modern world snaps into focus. Computers. The Internet.
The Internet began as the ARPANET, a military project.
Satellites, GPS, lasers, jet engines. Where did the initial high-risk research and development for all of that come from?
The military. The taxpayer. The public took 100% of the risk for decades. Then, once the technology was mature and viable, it was handed over to corporations like IBM, Boeing, AT&T, and now Google and Microsoft to market for private profit.
It's like a venture capital firm where the sole investor, the taxpayer, takes all the risk but gets absolutely zero equity in the final product.
A great analogy. And that is why the Soviet threat was so essential to the whole system.
Yeah.
You cannot sell that economic model to a democratic public on its own merits.
You can't go to Congress and say, hey, we're going to tax you to the hilt to help Boeing develop a new jet engine so they can dominate the commercial aviation market in 20 years.
They'd laugh you out of the room. But you can say, we need this new bomber with this revolutionary jet engine to stop the Red Menace from destroying freedom. And you get a blank check.
This explains the whole peace dividend disappointment in the 1990s. I remember that vividly. When the Berlin Wall fell, there was this huge global sense of relief.
Of course.
People were seriously talking about how we could finally start building nukes and start fixing our bridges and schools. We had spent trillions on the Cold War. Now we could finally spend that money on ourselves.
And what actually happened to the Pentagon budget?
Nothing. It dipped for, what, a hot second? And then it went right back up, and now it's higher than it ever was during the Cold War.
That is the smoking gun for Chomsky's argument. If the Cold War was really about the Soviets, the military budget should have dropped to near zero in 1992. It didn't.
Which proves the Soviet threat was the pretext, not the reason.
The reason, the underlying function, was the domestic economy. The Pentagon system is an insurance policy for high-tech industry. And you don't cancel your insurance just because one particular burglar moves out of the neighborhood.
You just find a new burglar.
You find a new burglar, you invent a new threat. First, it was international narco-traffickers. Then it was rogue states. Then, of course, the war on terror.
The villain changes, the budget remains, the system is incredibly resilient.
It is.
Okay, so that covers the domestic motive, the economic engine that needs constant feeding. But we also have to talk about the international motive. The book calls it the grand area.
Right.
This sounds like something out of a Risk board game, but it was actual State Department policy, wasn't it?
Oh, very much so. During World War II, as it became clear the Allies would win, the Council on Foreign Relations and the State Department convened high-level planning groups. They asked a very pragmatic, non-ideological question. What is the minimum portion of the world that the United States needs to control to ensure our economy remains dominant and prosperous in the post-war era?
And the answer was basically most of it.
The answer was what they called the Grand Area. It included, at a minimum, the entire Western Hemisphere, the Far East, and the former British Empire, which included the crucial energy resources of the Middle East.
And the goal wasn't just to influence these places, but to integrate them.
To integrate them all into one giant, open economic system centered on the United States.
And in this system, there's a very clear hierarchy. We aren't all equal partners.
Not at all. There's a sharp division of labor. You have the North, the industrial centers like the U.S., Western Europe, and later Japan. And then you have the South, what we used to call the Third World.
And what is the function of the South in this system?
The function of the South is to service the North.
Service how, specifically?
By providing three things: cheap raw materials and resources, like oil and copper and bananas, cheap labor for assembly plants, and markets for our manufactured goods.
So they're not supposed to develop their own independent, diversified industries that might compete with the North?
Absolutely not. That would violate their service function. They're supposed to export copper, not build their own electronics. They're supposed to export oil, not build their own chemical plants. They're supposed to import our cars, not build their own.
So when we talk about the Cold War, Chomsky is arguing that the real underlying conflict wasn't East versus West between the U.S. and the USSR. It was North versus South.
That is the primary conflict. The rivalry with the Soviets was a sideshow, a very dangerous sideshow that could have ended the world, no doubt. But it often served as a justification, as a cover story, for the real ongoing war. The war to discipline the Third World and keep it in its service role.
Which brings us perfectly to our second guidepost, the threat. If the Soviet Union wasn't the primary target, who was? Who were actually fighting in Vietnam or Guatemala or Chile or Iran?
According to the internal planning documents, the enemy has a consistent name.
And that is?
Independent nationalism.
Independent nationalism. That sounds pretty reasonable, actually. I mean, shouldn't countries be independent and nationalist in the sense of caring for their own people?
It sounds reasonable to us, but not if you're managing a global empire. From the perspective of the Grand Area planners, independent nationalism is the single greatest threat.
Why?
Because it means a country might decide to use its own resources for its own population, rather than for the benefit of U.S. investors and corporations.
The book quotes Winston Churchill here. It's from a private briefing, not one of his public speeches. He says something like, "We were like rich men, dwelling at peace within their habitations, and that the hungry nations must be kept in check."
It's a chillingly honest and concise summary of the entire worldview. The rich men want to stay rich. If a hungry nation decides to, say, redistribute its land from a few wealthy oligarchs to millions of poor peasants, or nationalize its oil industry to fund education and healthcare.
That is a direct theft from the rich men who own that land or that oil.
Correct. It's an act of defiance.
But hold on. I can understand why the U.S. would be worried if a giant country like China or India did that. But we're talking about interventions in places like Grenada. Grenada is a tiny island. It produces nutmeg. We intervened in Nicaragua, an impoverished country the size of Alabama. How does Nicaragua, using its own meager resources, actually threaten the United States? It's a drop in the economic bucket.
You're right. It is. And this is where we have to understand the logic of the virus theory, or as the planners sometimes called it, the rot.
The rot that might spread?
The planners were never worried that the Nicaraguan army would march up and conquer Texas. That's absurd, and everyone knew it. They were worried about something much more dangerous.
The demonstration effect.
The threat of a good example. That's the key phrase.
Explain that.
If a tiny, poor country with very few resources, like Nicaragua or Grenada, can succeed in independent development, if they could defy the U.S., pull themselves out of misery, raise literacy, improve healthcare, and feed their people by using their own resources for themselves, then what happens?
The neighbors start watching.
Exactly. The peasants in Honduras, the slum dwellers in El Salvador, the farmers in Guatemala, they look next door at Nicaragua and they say, hey, they did it, why can't we?
And then the virus of independent development might infect them.
And then the rot spreads.
Yeah.
The entire system of control for the region begins to unravel. So the cold, brutal logic of the system dictates that you must destroy the virus before it can spread. You have to ensure that any attempt at independence results in misery and failure, not success.
So you sanction them. You mine their harbors. You fund a proxy army of terrorists to go in and blow up their schools and health clinics. You make the population scream with pain.
You turn that country into a basket case. And then once it's destroyed, you turn to the world and say, see, we told you, socialism doesn't work. But in reality, you never let it work. You strangled it in the crib.
This leads to a really dark realization about the word democracy. I mean, the title of the book is Deterring Democracy. We grow up believing the U.S. is the champion of democracy around the world. But according to this model, democracy is actually viewed as a major threat.
We have to be very precise with our terms here. The U.S. foreign policy establishment is perfectly fine with what you might call democratic forms. Voting, parliaments, a couple of political parties, all that stuff is fine as long as it doesn't change anything fundamental. What the elites are terrified of is actual democracy, which means popular participation.
The public actually getting involved and having a say?
Yes. There's a famous document Chomsky cites from the Trilateral Commission in the mid-70s. It was called The Crisis of Democracy. Now, the Trilateral Commission wasn't some fringe group. It was founded by David Rockefeller. Its members included Jimmy Carter and his entire foreign policy team. These were the absolute core of the liberal establishment.
And what was the crisis they identified in their report? Was it the rise of dictatorships?
No. The crisis, they argued, was that there was too much democracy in the United States and Europe.
Too much democracy. That's an incredible thing for them to say out loud.
It is. The problem wasn't totalitarianism abroad. The problem was that at home, the ignorant masses, that's women, minorities, young people, working people, the activists in the 1960s, were getting organized and entering the political arena.
They were making demands. Civil rights, an end to the war, environmental protections.
And the commission concluded that this excess of democracy was making the country ungovernable. Their solution.
I'm almost afraid to ask.
They argued that the system could only be healthy if the public returned to being passive and apathetic. They literally called for more moderation in democracy.
So the public's role is to be spectators of action, not participants. That's a quote from Walter Lippmann, another one of these elite thinkers.
A perfect summary. Your job is to show up every 4 years, push a button to ratify one of the pre-selected representatives of the business class, and then go home and shut up so the responsible men can run the show without being bothered by you.
And if a country in the South tries to implement real democracy, where the poor and the landless actually have a voice and can make demands, that is a 5-alarm fire for the system.
Look at the stark contrast between Nicaragua and El Salvador in the 1980s. This is a central case study in the book, and it's a perfect illustration of the principle.
Lay it out.
In Nicaragua, you had the Sandinistas. Now, whatever you think of their leftist ideology, they were, in fact, organizing the poor. They ran a massive literacy campaign. They set up health clinics. They held an election in 1984 that international observers from Western Europe called surprisingly fair and open.
And the U.S. response?
We declared them a totalitarian threat to the hemisphere, a Soviet beachhead. We mined their harbors, which is an act of war. We created a proxy army, the Contras, largely from the remnants of the old dictator's National Guard, to go in and terrorize the countryside.
Okay, so that's Nicaragua. Meanwhile, right next door in El Salvador.
You had a brutal military government backed by the coffee oligarchy. They were running death squads. They were murdering labor leaders, students, peasant organizers, and even priests and nuns in broad daylight. The carnage was unbelievable. Archbishop Oscar Romero was assassinated while saying Mass.
But because they were on our side.
Because they were reliably protecting the Grand Area and the interests of U.S. investors. The Reagan administration hailed El Salvador as a fledgling democracy.
That's Orwellian.
It's the dictionary of power. The Sandinistas, who held a competitive election, were totalitarian because they disobeyed orders from Washington. The Salvadoran junta, which was murdering its own people, was democratic because it followed orders. The words lose their dictionary meaning. They just become code words for compliant and non-compliant.
This is heavy stuff. It completely flips the entire moral script of the last half century, but it raises a huge practical question.
Go on.
If this model is true, if the U.S. government is supporting death squads and crushing independent movements just to protect the profits of rich men, how do they get away with it? The American people are not psychopaths. If you told the average voter, we are starving Nicaraguan children so United Fruit can keep its profit margins high, they'd revolt.
They absolutely would. And that brings us to our third and perhaps most complex guidepost, manufacturing consent.
Chomsky calls this Hume's paradox.
Right. After the philosopher David Hume, he noticed something very simple but profound centuries ago. In a country like England or the United States that is relatively free, the government cannot control the people by force for very long.
We have rights. We have a constitution. You can't just send the army into the streets to beat everyone into submission every time they disagree with a policy. It wouldn't work.
So if you can't control them with force, with a stick,
You have to control what they think. You have to control their minds.
you have to control the narrative.
Okay, but hold on. Mind control starts to sound like tinfoil hat territory. We have a free press. We have thousands of news outlets. Nobody is putting a gun to the head of the editor of the New York Times and telling them what to print.
That's a fair and important pushback. And Chomsky would agree with you 100%. This is not a conspiracy where 5 guys in a smoky room decide the headlines for the week.
So how does it work?
It's a market system. Think of it like a series of filters.
A filter system, okay.
Imagine the news is water flowing from a huge reservoir. That reservoir is reality. It's everything that happens in the world. It's messy, it's complicated, it's contradictory. But before that water reaches your tap at home, it has to pass through a series of powerful filters.
What are the filters?
The first and most important is ownership. Who owns the major media outlets? They're not independent charities. They're massive corporations. For years, General Electric, a huge defense contractor, owned NBC. Disney owns ABC. These companies are part of the very corporate system they're supposed to be reporting on.
Okay, so that's one filter. What's the next one?
Advertising. Who pays the bills for the New York Times or CNN? Other massive corporations. If you consistently run stories that attack the core premises of corporate capitalism or question the legitimacy of U.S. foreign policy, you're going to lose your advertisers. You'll go out of business.
So it's not overt censorship. It's more like a structural bias. You hire editors and reporters who have already internalized the values of the owners and advertisers. You don't have to tell them what to write. They already know what constitutes a responsible or serious story.
Exactly. It's a system of selection. People who don't fit the mold get weeded out. They don't get promoted. And the intellectuals, the pundits you see on TV, the experts from the think tanks, they play a crucial role in setting the agenda.
This is the bewildered herd idea.
From Walter Lippmann, the dean of American journalism, he was very open about this. He called the general public the bewildered herd.
That's not a very flattering nickname.
He didn't mean it to be. He was an elite liberal progressive, and he genuinely believed the world was far too complex for the common person to understand. He said the function of the herd is to be spectators, not participants, while the specialized class of responsible men, people like him, make the decisions.
And to keep the herd from getting spooked and trampling the whole operation.
You have to engineer consent, in the words of Edward Bernays, the father of public relations. You have to simplify and emotionalize the issues. And most of all, you have to frighten them.
Fear is the primary tool.
Always. If the herd is frightened of the Soviets, of drugs, of terrorists, of the latest bogeyman, they will huddle together and look to the shepherd, to the leaders, for protection. They won't ask difficult questions about economic policy or international law. They'll just say, save us.
One of the most powerful ways this manufacturing of consent works in practice is in how we process victims of violence. The book draws this distinction between worthy versus unworthy victims.
This is a devastatingly effective analytical tool. Once you see this pattern, you truly cannot unsee it in the news today. The rule is very simple.
Lay it out.
If an atrocity is committed by one of our official enemies, the victims are worthy.
Right.
We must cry for them. We must see their faces on the front page. We must hear their stories. We must demand justice and intervention.
The book uses the example of a Polish priest, Father Populusko, who was murdered by the communist secret police in Poland in the 1980s.
A terrible, brutal crime. And the U.S. media covered it nonstop. It was on the front page of the New York Times for weeks. There were outraged editorials. It was held up as definitive proof of the evil of the entire Soviet system. He was a worthy victim.
But then Chomsky contrasts that with what was happening at the same time in our backyard in El Salvador.
In El Salvador, our client state was murdering priests and nuns on a regular basis. Archbishop Romero, as we mentioned. 4 American churchwomen who were raped and murdered by the Salvador National Guard. 6 of the country's leading Jesuit intellectuals dragged from their beds and executed by a U.S.-trained battalion. The scale of the violence against the church was far worse than in Poland.
And the coverage.
Minimal.
Yeah.
Dry. Buried on the back pages. It was framed as unfortunate as caught in the crossfire or the work of right-wing extremists out of control. There was no moral outrage. There were no calls to bomb the Salvadoran government.
Because their victims were unworthy. Their suffering didn't serve the interests of the American state. In fact, it embarrassed it.
Exactly. It's what the book calls the pragmatic criterion. When they do it, it's genocide, it's terror, it's an assault on humanity. When we or our clients do it, it's a regrettable error, a counterinsurgency, or simply restoring order.
Let's look at another case. The invasion of Panama in 1989, Operation Just Cause.
A perfect example.
I remember the headlines. We were going in to get the dictator, Manuel Noriega, the bad guy, the narco-trafficker who was once on the CIA payroll.
Right. That was the script. We are protecting American lives and fighting the war on drugs. But what was the reality on the ground? The U.S. military bombarded civilian neighborhoods in Panama City. The entire neighborhood of El Chorrillo was incinerated by air attacks.
And the civilian casualties?
The U.S. government says a few hundred. Panamanian human rights groups say several thousand. The truth is, we don't know, because the U.S. military buried many of the bodies in mass graves.
Did the American media show the incinerated neighborhoods? The bodies?
No. They showed heroic soldiers giving candy to Panamanian kids. They showed Noriega's ugly mugshot. The fact that the invasion was a massive violation of international law. The real civilian toll. It was completely filtered out of the mainstream discussion. The media's job was to portray an act of aggression as a benevolent police action.
It's amazing how effective that filtering process is. Even now, looking back, it takes a conscious effort to see the Panama invasion as an aggressive war. The liberation narrative is just so deeply baked in.
That is the power of a well-functioning system of indoctrination. It doesn't just tell you what to think, it defines the boundaries of what is thinkable.
Okay. We've covered a lot of ground. This is incredibly dense. We've looked at the motives, the need for a state-subsidized economy and a managed global system. We've looked at the real threat-independent nationalism, and we've looked at the method of control, the media filters, and manufacturing consent.
Right.
Let's try to pull the camera all the way back now. I want to visualize the whole machine, the whole system map based on what we've discussed.
Let's map it out. Let's build it piece by piece. Imagine a cycle.
Okay, I'm ready. Where do we start?
We start at the top with the planners. This is the state-corporate nexus, the elites in government and in the major corporations. Their primary goal is to maintain the grand area, a global environment that is stable, predictable, and open to their investment and resource extraction.
To maintain that grand area, they need to control the service areas, the third world.
Exactly. But the service areas, the people who live there, have a recurring tendency to revolt. You get that virus of nationalism. So the planners need tools to crush that nationalism whenever it appears.
And the tools are things like military invasion, CIA-backed coups, economic sanctions, and funding proxy armies.
Yes. But those tools are expensive. And frankly, they are ugly. The American people wouldn't support them if they saw them clearly.
So you need the domestic public, the bewildered herd, to pay for it all through their taxes and to allow it to happen morally. And that's where the propaganda feedback loop starts.
Correct. The cycle begins when the planners, through the intellectual class and the media, generate fear.
The Russians are coming. The narco-traffickers are coming. The terrorists are coming. The madman dictator's about to get a nuke.
This constant cultivated fear then manufactures public consent.
The public gets scared and agrees to the massive tax hikes for the military and looks the other way on the foreign intervention.
Then the intervention occurs. The virus in the service area is crushed, restoring the favorable investment climate.
And at the very same time, that massive military spending acts as a subsidy that flows from the public treasury into the accounts of the high-tech corporations.
Which means power is consolidated. The corporate elites get richer and more powerful. The military-industrial complex gets stronger. The third world is kept in its subordinate role, and the bewildered herd is kept frightened and distracted, ready for the next cycle.
Fear leads to consent, which leads to intervention, which leads to subsidy, which leads to consolidated power, which then needs a new fear to start the cycle all over again.
It is, in a sense, a perpetual motion machine of power and profit.
When you lay it out like that, it's depressingly functional. It's a closed loop.
It is. And that leads to the final and most important point of the whole analysis, the crisis in perception itself.
Right. We often look at American foreign policy. We look at the Vietnam War or the war on terror in Iraq and Afghanistan or the chaos we helped create in Central America, and we say it was a failure.
We say America blundered, we got bogged down, it was a tragic mistake, we didn't understand the culture.
But Chomsky's argument is, no. From the system's point of view, it wasn't a blunder at all.
Precisely. If you judge the policy by humanitarian metrics, did it bring peace? Did it bring democracy? Did it reduce poverty? Did it improve human rights? Then yes, it's a catastrophic, undeniable failure.
But those aren't the system's metrics. Those are our metrics.
Exactly. If you judge the policy by the system's actual goals, did we successfully destroy the independent nationalist movement? Did we ensure the country remains open to foreign investment, even if it's a ruin? And most importantly, did we prevent the virus of a good example from spreading to the neighbors?
Then it wasn't a failure at all. It was a resounding success.
Vietnam was destroyed. It was bombed back to the Stone Age. But the virus was killed. The threat that it might offer a model for independent development for the rest of Southeast Asia was eliminated. The region was inoculated by terror.
The same in Central America. The region was devastated by the wars of the 80s, creating the poverty and instability that drives migration today. But it was successfully inoculated against the threat of popular democracy.
No peasant in Guatemala is looking at Nicaragua today and saying, I want that. They're looking at a ruin. By the cold logic of the planners, the grand area was secured. Mission accomplished.
That is the hardest part of this entire analysis to accept. That the cruelty and the destruction aren't a bug in the software, they're a feature.
They are a rational and necessary requirement to keep the system functioning as designed. And that, the book argues, is why it continues. The Cold War is over, the Soviet Union is gone, but the interventions continue. The military budget continues to grow.
Because the underlying function of the system hasn't changed. We just changed the dust jacket on the book. We swapped out the red menace for the terrorist menace.
Precisely. The crisis in perception is realizing that we aren't the good guys stumbling around trying our best to save the world. According to this model, we are the rational managers of a global enterprise, doing whatever is necessary, no matter how brutal, to keep the factory running.
And once you see the system from that perspective, you can't go back to watching the evening news the same way ever again.
No, you can't. You become a permanent skeptic. You start asking different questions. You start asking cui bono. Who benefits from this policy? When they tell me to be afraid of this new enemy, what policy are they trying to sell me now?
You stop being a spectator of action.
And hopefully, you start becoming a participant in democracy.
We're going to have to leave it there. This is a dense, challenging book, and we've only really scratched the surface. But I hope this gives you a new lens, a new analytical tool to view history and the morning headlines.
This project is free and publicly accessible. If you'd like to support the time, tools, and research behind crisis and perception, you can become a supporter on Patreon.
For a shorter visual overview of this topic, see the mini explainer linked in the description.
If you enjoy this kind of systems-level analysis, please like, subscribe, and comment with books or topics you'd like us to explore next.